The first time I heard the Valtho speak, I was on my knees in the rubble of Kepler Station, breathing recycled air through a cracked helmet, watching the stars through a hole in the hull that used to be a wall. My name is Caleb Horn. I was 26 years old, a structural engineer assigned to the station's outer ring, and I had just watched 14 people I knew disappear in a single pulse of light that made no sound at all. That is the thing nobody warned us about. Alien weapons do not roar. They simply erase. The broadcast came 11 minutes later. It reached every human device simultaneously. Our phones, our ships, our satellites, every radio antenna on Earth. The voice was translated into perfect English, perfect Mandarin, perfect Arabic, every major language at once, and it said this: humanity has been assessed. Humanity has been found to be a Category 3 pre-collapse species. You will cease expansion beyond your solar boundary within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in assisted extinction. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification. That was it. No demands, no list of conditions. A notification. The way you would notify an ant colony before pouring water into their hill. I sat in that broken station for 6 more hours before rescue arrived. During those 6 hours, I had nothing to do but breathe carefully and think. And what I kept thinking was not about fear, not about death, not about the 14 people who had been erased 11 minutes ago. What I kept thinking was this: they called it a notification. Something about that word made me angrier than I had ever been in my life. By the time the rescue shuttle docked and the crew pulled me out, my hands had stopped shaking. I want to be honest about that. They had been shaking since the moment the pulse hit, but somewhere in those 6 hours of sitting alone in the dark with 14 empty suits floating around me, the shaking stopped, and it never really started again. I was not special. I did not go home and quietly grieve and then decide to fight back. What I am telling you is not a hero's origin story. It is something more ordinary, and I think more terrifying. Across Earth, across every station and colony and outpost, humanity had managed to scratch into the void. The same thing was happening to millions of people at once. Not rage exactly, not grief exactly, something quieter than both, a decision made without words. Feltari gave us 30 days to pull back our ships and our people and our presence from the edge of our own solar system. We spent those 30 days doing something entirely different. I know because I was there. I watched it happen around me. The way you watch a river rise, you do not see the individual drops. You only notice after some time has passed that the water is much higher than it was before. The first thing that happened was that 3 separate research programs that had been moving slowly for years simply accelerated overnight. Nobody ordered it. Nobody sent a directive down from a government office saying go faster. The scientists working on those programs just stopped sleeping as much. They stopped attending meetings that did not directly advance the work. They stopped writing papers for journals that would take months to publish. They started sharing raw data with anyone who asked, including rivals, including competitors, including people at institutions they had spent careers arguing with. The usual territorial walls of academia dissolved inside of a week. I watched this from the engineering division at the Johannesburg Recovery Center, where I had been sent after my medical clearance. My job was officially to write a structural assessment of the damage patterns the Veil theory weapons had left on Kepler station. Unofficially, I was one of several hundred engineers being quietly asked a different question: what do you know that might be useful? I did not have a dramatic answer. I knew structural physics, I knew material stress loads, I knew how things were built to withstand certain forces, but what I found sitting in those briefing rooms with metallurgists and propulsion specialists and people who built sensors for a living was that none of us individually knew very much together. Though we were starting to see patterns, the Veil theory pulse weapon worked by disrupting molecular cohesion. It did not need to be aimed with great precision because it spread on contact with any solid object. This was efficient. It was also, as one of our physicists pointed out on a Tuesday afternoon with the casual tone of someone commenting on the weather, reversible in theory if you could generate a counter-frequency field at the point of impact. You might be able to blunt the spread, not stop it, not reflect it, just slow it enough that a ship could survive a glancing hit instead of a direct one. Might she said in theory. By the following Tuesday, she had a working model running in simulation. This is what I mean about the river rising, no single drop, just water higher than before. The 30 days ended. The Veil theory scanned our solar boundary. Our ships were still there, every single one. We had not moved a single vessel, but backward we had in fact quietly moved several additional ones forward, not as a military gesture, as a measurement. We wanted to know exactly where they were and what they were doing. Another broadcast came. Language was the same. The tone was marginally cooler, if that is possible, for a species communicating through translation software. It said, "Non-compliance has been noted. Reclassification to Category 2 is initiated. A demonstration will be provided." We did not fully understand what Category 2 meant at the time. We learned quickly. A demonstration was provided at the Mars Transit Hub, a structure we had spent 9 years building, gone in 4 seconds of pale light. 23 people were on it. I knew one of them. His name was Owen Price. He had fixed a water recycler for me 3 years earlier at a station in the asteroid belt, and he had done it without being asked because he noticed I was struggling with a wrench fitting, and he had the right tool. He was 41 years old. He collected old paper maps of places on Earth that no longer looked the same as they did when the maps were drawn. I am telling you about Owen Price because this story is not about statistics. Statistics are how the Veil theory thought about us. They were counting category numbers and compliance percentages and projected timelines for collapse. They were not counting Owen Price and his maps. We were. The world did not erupt into panic after the Mars demonstration. I think the Veil theory expected that panic would have suited them. Panic leads to poor decisions in time, internal conflict, the kind of fracturing that makes a species easy to manage. What happened instead was something they clearly did not predict, because their next broadcast took 11 days to arrive instead of the usual pattern of immediate response. What happened was silence, not the silence of defeat, the silence of a species that has gone very, very quiet and very, very focused. Government stopped arguing about resource boundaries, the territorial water disputes, the Satellite orbit contracts, the licensing, fights over asteroid mining rights, all of it either paused or resolved itself. With remarkable speed, not because people had suddenly become generous, because they had all looked at the same problem and understood without anyone having to say it out loud that the argument they were in the middle of was suddenly much less important than the argument they were about to be in. I was reassigned again, this time to a facility outside of Oslo that did not officially exist in any public record. I signed a document that I cannot detail. Here, I will only say that what I found when I arrived was not what I expected. I expected military planning, officers, and strategies and maps with projected battle lines. There were some of those. Yes, but they were in a side room. The main building was full of scientists, and they all had the look of people who had not thought about anything except at their work in a very long time. Red eyes, cold food, whiteboards covered in notation so dense it looked decorative. I met a woman there named Lena Graves. She was a theoretical physicist from Cambridge. She had not left the building in 3 weeks. She did not look ashamed of this. She looked like someone running a race she intended to finish. She explained to me in the simplest terms she could manage that the Veil Thari's biggest advantage was not their weapons. It was their certainty. They had observed enough civilizations rise and fall to believe the outcome here was already written. They were not fighting us, they were managing a process. What we needed to do, she said, was introduce a variable they had not accounted for. I asked her what variable. She smiled. She had not smiled in a while, and it showed around the edges. She said, us. The next broadcast from the Veil Thari arrived on the 11th day. It reclassified humanity to Category 1, which their translation software rendered as a phrase that meant approximately terminal approach. They gave us 6 months. 6 months before the full fleet would arrive to complete what they called the process. 6 months. Every engineer, physicist, biologist, chemist, material scientist, software architect, propulsion specialist, weapons designer, and problem solver on Earth heard that number and did the same thing. They got to work. I went back to my desk. I picked up my tools. Beside me, a man named Arthur Cole was running stress fracture calculations on a new hull alloy at 3:00 in the morning, and he was humming to himself, and he did not look afraid. Across the room, a young woman named Grace Elliott had fallen asleep at her station with her notes still open, and someone had put a jacket over her shoulders without waking her, and she would be back at it before sunrise. 6 months. The Veil Thari had given us 6 months because their model said that was more than enough time for a Category 1 species to understand the hopelessness of resistance and begin the compliance process. Their models were built on everything they knew about every civilization they had ever encountered. They had never encountered us. I looked up at the ceiling of that facility outside Oslo, and beyond it the dark, and somewhere in that dark a fleet that had extinguished more civilizations than I could count. And I thought about Owen Price and his maps, and I thought about Lena Graves and her smile, and I thought about the 6 months ahead of us. Then I turned back to my work. There was no time to waste. The 6 months did not feel like 6 months. Time does strain things when the entire species you belong to is pointed in the same direction. Days collapsed into each Other weeks vanished. I would look up from a set of calculations and discover that 4 days had passed, and the only reason I knew was because Arthur Cole had started a new notebook and someone had replaced the food in the cold unit near the door. I want to tell you what those months were actually like, not the version that gets written in summaries and mission reports where everything sounds clean and strategic and inevitable. The real version, which was messy and exhausting and occasionally extraordinary in ways that still catch me off guard when I think about them. Late at night, the facility outside Oslo was one of dozens. I know that now. At the time, I only knew what was directly in front of me, which was a project we had quietly named the Shell program. The concept was straightforward, even if the execution was not. We wanted to give our ships the ability to survive a veil fairy pulse hit, not deflect it, not return it, just survive it long enough to keep operating. That was the entire goal. Lena Graves had given us the theoretical foundation. What we needed was engineering, which is where I came in. The problem was that the counter frequency field she described required a power output that our current ships could not sustain, not even close. Running the field during combat would mean shutting down either propulsion or life support, and neither of those was an option you wanted to exercise while being fired at by an alien fleet. So we needed more power, and to get more power, we needed either a better energy source or a more efficient delivery system, and either of those we needed things we did not yet have. This is the part that nobody likes to talk about when they tell the story of those months. It was not a story of brilliant solutions arriving on schedule. It was a story of people running into walls over and over again. The difference, the only real difference, was that when we hit a wall, we did not stop. We looked at the wall. We measured it. We asked each other what it was made of and how thick it was, and whether there was a way around it or through it, or whether we needed to accept that this particular wall was not the right path and find a different one. I hit my first major wall in week 3. The alloy I was using for the field emitter housing could not handle the thermal variance we were generating. It would work perfectly for about 40 seconds and then develop micro fractures that spread faster than any repair system could manage. 40 seconds was not long enough. We needed at least 3 minutes of sustained operation. I went through 14 alloy combinations in 10 days. None of them worked. On the 15th attempt, I was so tired that I made a mistake in my material composition notes, and the resulting alloy was not what I had intended to test, but it held. It held for 4 minutes and 22 seconds before showing any stress signatures at all. I sat very still for a long moment after seeing those results. Then I went back and found the mistake, and then I stared at the mistake for a while because it was a mistake that made something better, and there is a particular feeling that comes with that which is difficult to describe. It is not quite joy and not quite disbelief. It is something more like the universe briefly agreeing with you. I reported the result. By the next morning, Lena had a revised theoretical model incorporating the new parameters. By the end of that week, 2 other teams had used our result to unlock problems they had been stuck on for different reasons. This is how progress actually moves, not in clean lines, in a web of small accidents and adjustments that build on each other until suddenly the thing you could not Do becomes the thing you are doing. Arthur Cole, who had been working on the power delivery problem in parallel, came to find me in week 5 with a set of numbers that made him look like he had surprised himself. He had found a configuration for the magnetic containment coils that reduced energy lost during field projection by 31%. It was not a solution on its own, but combined with the new alloy and a routing adjustment that Grace Elliott's team had developed for a completely different application, it brought us to within 18% of the power output we needed. 18% was still a gap, but it was a gap we could see across, which is different from a gap you cannot see across. The work was not all in our facility. That is important to understand. While we were building the shell program in Oslo, other teams in other places were building other things. I heard fragments of their work through briefings and shared data packets. Group in Pretoria was developing something called the Reach Array, which I will tell you about later. Teams in Vancouver and in Osaka were working on propulsion concepts that sounded impossible when described in summary and slightly less impossible when you looked at the math. In Sao Paulo, a woman named Harriet Cross was heading a project that involved a class of materials that did not exist 18 months earlier and were now being manufactured in quantities that would have seemed like a fabrication if someone had predicted them. None of us knew the full picture. The full picture was too large for any one person to hold. We each knew our piece, and we trusted that the other pieces were being built with the same desperate care that we were building ours. That trust was not blind. It was earned week by week as results from other teams arrived and proved that the other people were in fact working at the same pace and with the same commitment. Something was happening to us during those months. I noticed it but did not have words for it at the time. We were becoming, as a collection of people, something different from what we had been individually, not unified in the way that word usually means, where everyone agrees and everyone moves in the same direction cheerfully. We were unified the way a cable is unified, many separate strands twisted together, each strand doing its own job, the whole thing stronger because of how they held each other. I missed my old life. Sometimes I had an apartment in Cape Town that I had not seen in months. I had a sister named Diane who sent me short messages every few days that I often did not read until a day after they arrived because I was in the middle of something. I had a habit of running along the waterfront in the early morning that I had not maintained since Oslo. These things were still real. They existed. I held them somewhere behind my sternum like a small warm weight, and they reminded me why the work mattered, which is different from distracting me from the work. The Veil Theory sent 2 more broadcasts during those 6 months. The first came at the 3-month mark. It was brief and its tone had shifted slightly, though our linguists debated exactly how. The translation gave us preliminary assessment indicates continued non-compliance, Category 1. Status confirmed. Arrival timeline unchanged. What was interesting about this broadcast was what it did not say. It did not say what their preliminary assessment had actually found. We had been careful to keep our development programs off any system they might be monitoring. We did not know if we had succeeded, but the fact that they said preliminary assessment and not final assessment suggested that something had Made them look twice. Lena Graves heard this and said only good. The second broadcast came 6 weeks before the fleet's projected arrival. It was longer than any previous communication. Translation was dense, and our linguists spent 3 days working through the layers of it. The core meaning as best they could determine was this: humanity's noncompliance has been escalated to a priority classification. The arrival of the Resolution fleet has been moved forward by 3 weeks. 3 weeks earlier, they were coming 3 weeks earlier than they had said. The room went quiet when that news came through, a different kind of quiet than the one I described before. This one had an edge to it. Then Arthur Cole looked up from his workstation and said in the most ordinary voice that he had just cracked the 18% gap. He had found the remaining power. It had been there in the routing geometry all along. He just had not seen it until now. He said this in the same tone you might use to mention that you had found the keys you had been looking for. Calm, almost casual, and then he went back to his screen to verify the numbers. Before sharing them, the room did not erupt. It did not need to. The people in it simply turned back to their own work with a slightly different quality of focus, not panic, not relief, something between the two that felt to me very specifically human. 3 weeks earlier, fine, we had more work to do, so we worked faster. I want to tell you about a moment from week 19 because it is the moment I think about most often when I think about those months. It was 2:00 in the morning. Most of the day team had gone to their bunks. The night team was smaller. I was running a final stress simulation on the updated emitter housing. Across the room, a young man named Samuel Park, who had joined our team 6 weeks earlier directly from a university program he had left midterm to come work with us, was eating from a container of cold noodles with a fork, looking at a screen full of numbers and slowly shaking his head. I asked him what he was looking at. He said he was looking at projections, not engineering. Projections, population projections. He had been trying to calculate something during his off hours, trying to understand the actual scale of what we were attempting. He had a habit of needing to understand the size of a problem before he could work on the solution. He said he could not quite make his mind accept the number of people on Earth and on the stations and on the ships, all of them, depending on what we were building in this room and in the other rooms like it. I asked him if that made it harder to work. He thought about it for a moment, then he said, no, it makes it simpler. There is only one acceptable outcome, so there is only one direction to move. He went back to his noodles. I went back to my simulation. Outside the facility, the Norwegian winter was doing what Norwegian winters do, which is to say it was dark and cold and completely indifferent to any of our concerns. The simulation completed. The housing held, not for 4 minutes and 22 seconds this time, for 9 minutes and 47 seconds before any stress response at all. 9 minutes and 47 seconds was enough. I saved the result, flagged it for the morning team, and allowed myself exactly 30 seconds of sitting completely still and doing nothing. Then I started the next test sequence because we were 3 weeks closer to a deadline that had just been moved forward, and Samuel Park was right. There was only one acceptable outcome, so there was only one direction to move. The weeks that followed were a kind of controlled intensity that I do not have a perfect word for. Every team across every facility had the same experience. The problems that had seemed impossible 6 months ago were now merely very hard, and the problems that had been very hard were now solvable with enough focused effort, and the problems that were solvable had already been solved and handed off and built upon. We were not the example collection of people who had sat in those first briefings, wide-eyed and determined but uncertain. We had been changed by the work the way metal is changed by being worked, shaped under pressure into something with a different structure, more aligned, more capable of bearing load. I thought about the veil theory and their category system, Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, a taxonomy for civilizations, the way a biologist might categorize organisms, useful if you are observing from the outside, completely useless if you have misidentified what you are looking at. They had categorized us based on what we had been. They had assigned us a timeline based on the behavior of every other species that had faced what we were facing. They had not accounted for the possibility that we might be something their models had never seen before, not because we were genetically special or cosmically chosen, or any of the flattering things that civilizations like to believe about themselves, but because of something more specific and more strange. We were the species that responded to being told we could not survive by working harder than any model predicted was possible. We were the species that turned collective desperation into collective ingenuity, not perfectly, not without cost, but with a consistency that their data had never captured, because no civilization in their records had ever done it quite this way. This was Lena Graves's variable, not a technology, us, the actual unquantified reality of what happens when human beings decide that a thing has to be done. The Resolution fleet arrived 2 days ahead of their revised schedule. We were ready, not completely ready, not in the way you dream about being ready, where everything works perfectly and everyone is confident and the plan unfolds without friction. We were ready in the actual way, which means the show program was operational on 64% of our combat vessels. The reach array was functional but untested in real conditions. Our propulsion modifications had been installed on 40% of the fleet, and approximately 30% of our pilots had trained extensively on the new systems, while the others had trained on them for 3 weeks. 64%, 40%, 30%. These numbers sound incomplete. They were, but they were numbers that 3 months earlier had been 0. I was at a monitoring station in orbit when the fleet arrived. I was not a soldier. I had no business being there strategically, but I had built part of what was on those ships, and I had asked to see what happened, and someone senior enough to authorize it had looked at me for a long moment and then said yes. The fleet dropped out of whatever method they used for faster transit on the outer edge of our system. The sensors showed them as a bloom of signatures, dense and organized, far too many to count comfortably. They were enormous, individual ships larger than anything we had built. The formations were precise in a way that communicated long practice, the confidence of a force that had done this many times and never had reason to adjust. I heard the person next to me exhale. Then our fleet moved to intercept, and I watched 64% of our Ships activate their shell program. Fields and the fields held, flickering. Blue-white against the dark, and I thought of 14 empty suits floating in a broken station, and Owen Price and his maps, and Samuel Park and his cold noodles, and Arthur Cole and his 18%, and Grace Elliott asleep at her desk with someone's jacket over her shoulders. I thought of all of it at once, and then the first exchange began, and everything happened very fast. The first pulse they fired was a ranging shot. I know that now. At the time, I did not know the difference between a ranging shot and a full salvo. I only knew that a pale light crossed the dark between the two fleets and struck one of our ships, and the ship did not disappear. It shook. It vented atmosphere from one section. 2 of its 4 engines went dark, but it did not disappear. The monitoring station went very quiet. The Veil Theory fleet did not fire again immediately. I found out later, when we began to piece together a fuller picture of what had happened in those initial seconds, that the pause was not tactical caution. It was something they had not experienced in a very long time, possibly ever. They had fired a weapon that was supposed to end a ship, and the ship was still there, and their models had not included a contingency for that result. The pause lasted 11 seconds. Our fleet used 7 of those seconds to complete the formation shift that our commanders had spent 3 weeks drilling. The reach array came online across 19 vessels. Simultaneously, I watched the energy signatures climb on the sensor display beside me, and I thought of Harriet Cross in Sao Paulo and whatever she had built that made those readings possible. Our fleet fired first, not the reach array, not yet. Standard rail accelerated kinetic rounds, which sounds unimpressive in a universe full of energy weapons, but which have a characteristic that energy weapons do not. They cannot be dispersed by a field. You cannot absorb a physical object. You can try to intercept it, but interception requires knowing exactly where it is going, and our targeting systems, modified over 6 months by people who had not slept properly in half a year, had become something the Valthar scanners were not calibrated to track accurately. 3 of their forward ships took impacts not catastrophic, not enough to destroy them, but enough to damage, and more importantly, enough to surprise them. Their shields, which were designed with great sophistication against energy-based threats, had not been specifically optimized against physical projectiles, because no species they had encountered in recorded history used them as a primary weapon in the age of directed energy warfare. We used them because they worked, and because we had them. That was the entire reasoning. Second pause lasted 4 seconds. Then the Valthar fleet reorganized and fired a full salvo. I will not pretend that what followed was clean or triumphant. It was not. Ships were lost, our ships with people inside them. The shell program fields held for some hits and not for others, depending on the angle and the intensity. Vessels that had the new propulsion modifications moved faster than the targeting solutions the enemy had calculated, which meant many shots missed, but some did not. The losses were real. They hurt in a way that I carried in my chest for months afterward, and still carry now if I think about specific names. But here is what did not happen. We did not break. I watched the formation hold through the first full salvo. I watched our damaged ships continue to function. I watched the reach array lock onto 3 Valthari vessels, and I watched what the array did to them, which I will describe by saying only that the array had been designed to interact specifically with the energy systems that the Valthari used to power their weapons and shields. It did not destroy the ships, it confused them. For approximately 90 seconds, those three ships could neither fire nor maneuver with any reliability. 90 seconds is a long time in a battle. Our commanders had known it would be 90 seconds because that was what the models said, and the models had been built by people who had measured everything they could measure about the Valthari systems. From every piece of data we had collected, the models were right. The commanders used the 90 seconds the way they had planned to use them, and when those 90 seconds were over, the tactical picture had shifted in a way that the Valthari had not projected. The fleet level calculation they were running was not going the way it was supposed to go. They could see that, we could see from the way their formation shifted that they were recalculating, pulling their forward vessels back, compressing the formation. This was not a retreat, it was a reassessment. It was the first time in this conflict that they had needed to reassess anything. A man named Commander Gerald Fitch was in charge of our fleet. I had met him briefly during the final pre-engagement briefing. He was a quiet man in his B-50s with a kind of stillness that comes not from coldness but from absolute focus. When the Valthari formation shifted, Fitch made a decision that was not in any plan we had rehearsed. He moved our fleet forward toward them, closing the distance instead of holding position. This was unexpected. Our own people were not entirely sure why he did it. Later, he explained that he had watched the enemy's response time increase with each exchange. They were fast, but we were becoming faster, and more importantly, we were becoming more unpredictable. The we got, the harder it became for their long-range targeting to account for our modifications at close range. The advantages of their more advanced systems partially compressed. At close range, adaptability mattered more than hardware superiority. Adaptability was the one thing we had been practicing without pause for 6 months. Engagement lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. I say this in one sentence, and it sounds brief. It was not brief. It was 4 hours and 17 minutes of continuous decision-making by thousands of people on both sides, each decision building on the last, each adjustment triggering counter-adjustments. I sat at the monitoring station and watched the sensor display until my eyes ached, and I drank cold coffee, and I did not speak, except when someone asked me a direct technical question, and then I answered and went back to watching. There was a moment near the end of the second hour when our formation was compressed and 2 of our largest ships were temporarily disabled, and the Valthari had taken a position that their models probably told them was decisive. I felt something drop in my stomach, not panic, something more specific, the feeling of wondering if you had been wrong about a calculation you had trusted. Then Samuel Park's voice came over the tactical channel. He was aboard one of the disabled ships in an engineering role, which is why he had access to the channel. He was not supposed to speak on it. He spoke on it anyway. He said, the same calm voice with which he had told me there was only one acceptable outcome. The secondary array on Deck 7 is still functional, recommending its use for lateral interference. There was a Pause, then Gerald Fitch said, "Do it." The secondary array, which had been installed as a redundancy measure that most people had considered unlikely to be useful, proved useful. The lateral interference it generated disrupted the Velthari targeting solution for their decisive strike. The strike landed off-center on both disabled ships. Both ships survived. Both ships began emergency restart sequences. Samuel Park later received a commendation he was genuinely surprised by. He told me that he had just been paying attention. He said it as though paying attention were a small thing, but I have thought about it since, and I believe paying attention to what is actually happening instead of what you expected to happen is one of the harder things a person can do under pressure, and Samuel Park did it instinctively when it counted. The Valthar fleet began withdrawing at the 4-hour mark, not a disorganized withdrawal, careful, precise. Their formation remained coherent as they pulled back toward the outer system boundary. They did not fire during the withdrawal. We did not pursue aggressively. Both sides had damage. Both sides were recalibrating. Gerald Fitch did not declare victory over the fleet channel. He said, "Hold positions. Damage reports. Begin recovery operations." That was it. I sat at the monitoring station for a long time after the Valthar fleet crossed the outer boundary. The sensor display showed them maintaining distance, not leaving, just waiting, watching, the same way we were watching them. Around me, the monitoring station team was processing data and coordinating repairs and managing the dozens of immediate necessities that follow a combat engagement. Nobody was celebrating, nobody was weeping. The expressions I could see were focused and careful, the expressions of people who understood that what had just happened was significant, but who also understood that significant was not the same as finished. I thought about what Lena Graves had said months ago in that facility outside Oslo. She had said that the Valthar's biggest advantage was their certainty that they knew what we were, their certainty that they knew how this ended. I looked at the sensor display. Their fleet was still there, still vast, still formidable. We had not ended the conflict. We had not proven that we could outlast them in a sustained campaign. We had won one engagement against one fleet division, and we had done it with technology we had built in 6 months under conditions that would have seemed impossible a year before. But we had done it, and the Valthar I knew we had done it, and whatever their models said, whatever their category system told them about species like us, they now had a data point that contradicted everything they thought they knew. A category 1 species had stood in front of their fleet and not only survived but forced a withdrawal. Their models did not have a category 4. That I was certain of it, sitting there in the quiet monitoring station, watching their fleet hold position on the outer edge of our system. They were going to need new models, and that process was going to take time. They had assumed they would not need to spend on us, time that we intended to use. I finally stood up from the monitoring station. My legs were stiff. My eyes felt dry and heavy. I asked someone what time it was and was told it was early morning, which surprised me because I had not noticed the shift hours. A woman near me named Cora Webb, who ran the long-range sensor analysis, looked up from her screen and met my eyes. She did not say anything. She simply nodded once, the nod that means I No, I saw it too. I am still processing what it means. I nodded back. Then I went to find food and send a message to my sister Diane, who deserved to hear from me more often than she had been hearing from me. Outside in the dark past the hull of the station, the Valthar I fleet waited. The rest of the galaxy, those parts of it that monitored communications and tracked events in distant systems, had received data from this engagement through whatever methods they used to observe such things. We did not know yet what they would make of it. We did not know what conclusions were being drawn in the council chambers and command centers of civilizations that had watched the Valthar I operate for a very long time. Assumed they knew exactly how species at our level fared against them. We would find out, but that was later. For now, we had forced a pause. Something that was supposed to be a process. We had taken the notification they had sent us and returned it in the only language that seemed to translate cleanly across species lines. We were still here. The withdrawal of the Valthar fleet from the outer boundary did not feel like what I had imagined a victory would feel like. I had imagined in the abstract way you imagine things during the months of work, when the outcome is still uncertain. That something would lift, that there would be a moment of release, the way pressure in a sealed chamber releases. When the valve finally opens, it did not feel like that. What I actually felt, standing in the corridor outside the monitoring station with cold food in one hand and a message from Diane in my earpiece, was something more complicated and heavier than relief, something that made me stand very still for a moment before I could continue walking. We had pushed them back. We had made the Valthar, for the first time in a campaign that their records probably described as routine, recalculate. And in the hour since the engagement ended, something had shifted, not in space, but in the room around me and in the voices I was hearing over the station's communication channels. I want to be precise about what I mean, because what shifted was not confidence exactly, or pride, though both of those were present in various people in various amounts. What shifted was a quality of understanding. The people around me had built things, and those things had worked in conditions that could not be simulated, and now they knew that in the specific, undeniable way that you can only know something after it has been tested for real. Gerald Fitch called a command level review 18 hours after the engagement. I was not part of the command level. I was there because someone decided that having an engineering perspective in the room was useful, which I took to mean that the engineering questions were significant enough that they were worried about what the answers might be. The answers were not all comfortable. The shell program had performed above its modeled baseline on 61% of the vessels that used it. On the remaining 39%, it had performed within the modeled baseline, meaning it had worked as designed, but not better. There were no fields that had failed catastrophically. That was genuinely good news, but the power drain on sustained operation was higher than we had calculated, which meant that in a longer engagement, vessels would have to choose between field coverage and engine output more often than we had planned. For the reach array had worked, but its interference window of 90 seconds was, Lena Graves told the room quietly, the upper limit of its current design, not the middle of a range. We had been hoping it was closer to the middle. The Kinetic weapons had outperformed expectations. The propulsion modifications had outperformed expectations in the vessels where they were installed. These were genuine advantages that the Vilthari had not anticipated and had not yet developed a counter for, but counter development was something they were clearly capable of. And the time between this engagement and their next approach was time they would use for exactly that. Gerald Fitch listened to all of this with the same quality of focused stillness I had noticed before. When the reports were finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that what he needed from everyone in the room was an honest list of what we could improve and how long each improvement would take, and he needed that list in 48 hours. Nobody in the room argued that we should be celebrating instead of planning. Nobody said we had done enough. Thought did not appear to occur to anyone, and I found that both entirely predictable and quietly remarkable. We had 6 weeks, possibly 8, before the Vilthari completed their reassessment and returned. Fitch wanted the next version of every system we had deployed in the field, and he wanted it integrated, tested, and ready 48 hours for the improvement list. Then whatever time remained to execute it. I left the review and went to find Arthur Cole. He was, of course, already working. He had not waited for the review meeting to tell him that the power drain problem needed a solution. He had identified it in real time during the engagement from the telemetry data and had been working on it for 11 hours. He looked the way Arthur Cole always looked when he was deep in a problem, completely absent from the room he was physically in, present only in whatever space the problem occupied. I sat down across from him and told him what the review had said about the power drain. He nodded without looking up and said he already knew, and he had a partial solution, and he needed a materials check from me on 3 specific alloy composites that he thought might reduce the induction loss in the field coils. I did the check. 2 of the 3 were viable. He chose the one that was harder to work with because it was better and started reconfiguring his model. This is what I mean about who these people were. Arthur Cole did not need to be told to solve the problem. He did not need a review meeting or a directive or a structured process to begin working on it. He needed to know that the problem was real and that solving it mattered. Those 2 things he had already established from the data before any of us had sat in a room and made it official. I spent the next 4 days in a kind of compressed intensity that made the previous 6 months feel leisurely. By comparison, the improvement list that had been requested in 48 hours was submitted in 31. It was not a short list. Lena Graves added a theoretical note at the end of it that suggested a fundamental redesign of the reach array's resonance calibration that could extend the interference window from 90 seconds to somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes, but she estimated the redesign would take 6 weeks to build and 4 days to test. 6 weeks and 4 days was more time than we had. She submitted the note anyway. She said that it should be on record and that perhaps the timeline could be compressed. The timeline was compressed. I will not tell you how because I do not fully know how. I know that Harriet Cross's team in Sao Paulo was involved in that a materials breakthrough in their lab in week 3 of the improvement period contributed something significant to the resonance calibration problem. And that Lena Graves did not sleep for a period that her colleagues described to me in terms that I chose not to verify. Independently, the redesign was built. The testing was compressed to 2 days. It worked 4 minutes and 18 seconds of interference window, better than the lower bound Lena had projected, not quite the upper bound, but far better than the original 90 seconds. 4 minutes and 18 seconds is a long time in a battle. I knew that now. From experience, the propulsion modifications were extended to 83% of the fleet during the improvement period. The kinetic targeting systems received an upgrade that I was involved in directly, which I can say was largely Samuel Park's work, done remotely from the ship he was aboard, communicated over technical channels in clear, precise language that made the work easy to implement. He had a gift for explaining what needed to happen without filling the explanation with things that did not matter. I thought about what we were becoming during those weeks, not as individuals. I was still Caleb Horn, still running on insufficient sleep, still thinking about my apartment in Cape Town and whether the plant on my windowsill had survived this long without water. But as a collective thing, a species at work, we were different from the thing we had been before the first engagement. The difference was experience, not just the technical experience of having built and tested and deployed these systems in real conditions, the experience of having been in the thing we had been afraid of and having come through it, still functioning. That kind of experience changes the quality of your decisions in ways that are hard to articulate. You stop hedging in certain directions. You start trusting certain instincts that had previously been hypothetical. You know things in your body that you had only known in your calculations, and that knowledge is different, more stable, less frightened of itself. The veil Thar, I thought, had perhaps not accounted for this. They had models for species behavior in the face of existential threat, but their models were built on observation of species at their first encounter with that threat, species that had never been through it before, species operating on fear and theory. We had been through it. We were now operating on something else, not confidence exactly. I keep coming back to that word and discarding it because it is not quite right. What we had was closer to accuracy. We now knew the actual shape of the problem, not the imagined shape, the real one, and knowing the real shape of a problem is worth more than any amount of optimism about an imagined one. The Veil Thar's second approach came 5 weeks and 2 days after the first engagement, slightly earlier than Fitch had projected, which did not surprise me, said, because if he were running their fleet, he would want to arrive before the opponent was fully ready. They arrived with a larger formation this time, significantly larger. The number of vessels was sufficient to make clear that they had taken the first engagement seriously and were not going to make the same assessment error twice. This fleet was not a division. It was, by our best count, the equivalent of a full campaign group, the kind of force you send when you want to resolve a situation without further complications. I was at the same monitoring station. Cora Webb was beside me again. She looked at the sensor readings and said quietly, "That is a lot of ships." I said yes, it was. She said she hoped the array worked. I said I was fairly certain it would. She looked at me for a moment, then she went back to her sensors. What happened next is in the official records in far more detail than I can provide here. Second engagement was longer, harder, and more costly than the first. 17 of our vessels were lost, not disabled. Lost, I am not going to talk around that. 17 ships with full crews gone in the pale light that does not make any sound. I carry every one of those ships in a part of my memory that I do not access often because it is not a comfortable place to visit, but it is also not a place I would want to be without, because those crews were real, and what they did was real, and they deserve to be carried. What I will tell you is what happened at the 3-hour mark of the second engagement, when the Vale Theory had committed their full formation to a push that was designed to overwhelm our field coverage by sheer volume of simultaneous fire. Lena Graves' redesigned array activated across 31 of our vessels simultaneously. The interference window opened. 4 minutes and 18 seconds. Gerald Fitch used every second of it. The formation shift he executed in those 4 minutes and 18 seconds was something that I watched on the sensor display and could not entirely follow in real time because it was too fast and too complex. I understood it afterward when the analysts broke it down. He had used the interference window not to press a direct attack on disabled vessels as the Vale Theory probably expected, but to reposition the entire fleet into a geometry that made our kinetic weapons effective against their formations interior and made their salvos increasingly likely to hit their own vessels if they were not carefully managed. He had essentially turned their size into a liability in a very specific window of time. The Vale Theory adapted. They were good. They were very good, but adapting took time, and the geometry we had established required them to pull back from the push in order to manage their formation safely. They pulled back. The second engagement ended in a way that was harder to characterize than the first. Neither side had achieved a decisive result. We had held, they had failed to overwhelm us, but the losses on our side were real, and the Vale Theory fleet was still present at the outer system boundary, and the question of what came next was not answered by what had happened in the past 5 hours. Fitch called the second engagement a draw in a flat voice that made it clear he meant this as a technical assessment and not a celebration, a draw against the force that had sent us a notification about our own extinction. I heard the word and sat with it for a moment. A draw. Then I started thinking about the array and the power drain and the next version of the kinetic targeting system, and what Samuel Park would have to say about the performance data from the second engagement. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That was not a complaint. It was simply the nature of where we were and what we were. The monitoring station hummed around me. Cora Webb was already pulling analysis from the sensor logs. Arthur Cole, somewhere on a ship in the fleet, was certainly already looking at the field coil data. Lena Graves was probably already at a whiteboard outside the Vale Theory fleet held position, watching, waiting, recalculating again. The universe was paying attention to something it had not expected to see. So were we. There is a specific moment I return to when I think about who we were becoming in the long months of that conflict. It is not a dramatic moment. There are no weapons firing in it. Nobody is making a decision that will affect the outcome of an engagement. It is a Tuesday afternoon in the recovery period between the second and third encounters, and I am sitting across from Lena Graves in the common area of a station that serves as a coordination hub, and she is telling me that she is not sure anymore. I asked her what she was not sure about. She said us what we are doing, what we are turning ourselves into. I did not immediately answer. The common area was quiet. 2 technicians were eating at the far end. Through the port window, the stars were still, which they always are, but which I had stopped taking for granted. Lena was not a person who expressed uncertainty casually. In the months I had known her, she had been one of the most directed people I had ever worked alongside, focused to a degree that occasionally alarmed the people around her. To hear her say "I am not sure" was not an alarm exactly, but it was a signal that I took seriously. She said that she had been looking at the numbers, not the engineering numbers, a different kind of number, the resources we had redirected, the programs that had been paused or abandoned so that other programs could move faster, the decisions that had been made at levels above us about what mattered and what did not. She had been adding it up in the way she added up everything, methodically and without sentiment, and what she had arrived at was a picture that made her uncomfortable. We were very good at this now, she said, very good at building things to fight, very good at optimizing for the next engagement, and that was necessary. She understood that it was necessary. She did not have an argument against the necessity, but she had noticed something. She had noticed that the conversations had changed in the early months when the people in the facilities were working on the shell program and the reach array and the propulsion modifications. The conversations had been full of both the problem and the reason. People talked about the engineering, and they also talked about what the engineering was for the people on the stations, the people on Earth, the version of things they were trying to preserve. She said that lately the conversations were mostly about the engineering, and the reason had become assumed rather than spoken, which was efficient, but which she had begun to think was also a small and quiet kind of loss. I thought about this for a long time before I spoke. I told her that I thought she was right that we had changed, and I thought she was right that some of what had changed was a loss. The early months had a quality of purpose that was very near the surface. People wore it. You could see it in how they worked and how they spoke to each other. It was painful, and it was also in some way I struggled to name correctly alive. What we had now was different, more practice, more efficient, less near the surface. I was not sure that was worse necessarily, because you cannot keep grief and urgency at the surface of your daily existence for years at a time without it costing you something else. But I understood what she was pointing at. I asked her what she thought it meant. She said she did not know. She said she thought it meant that winning, if we won, would require us to do something afterward that might be harder than what we were doing now. We would have to remember what the reason was, not assume it, actually remember it. Owen Price and his maps, the 14 empty suits, all of it. She said she was not sure we would be good at that part. I said I was not sure either. We sat for a while without speaking. The technicians at the far end finished their food and left. The stars in the port window did not move. Then Lena said, "I need to show you something." She took out a tablet and showed me a set of calculations she had been working on. Not for any current project, something she was doing on her own time, which she technically had very little of, but apparently spent thinking about a problem she had not been asked to think about. The calculations were in assessment of the Veil theories, logistical situation. Their fleet at the outer boundary had been present for a long time now, far longer than any previous deployment in their recorded history of this type of operation. She had been building a model based on everything we knew about their energy systems and the distances involved of what it cost them to maintain that presence. The model said it was costing them considerably more than a typical resolution campaign in their records, because those campaigns were typically concluded in weeks, not months. The longer our conflict ran, the more resource-intensive their position became, and the more that resource consumption rippled back through whatever supply and logistics infrastructure they had built over their long history. She was not saying this was decisive. She was not saying it was a solution. She was saying it was a fact that changed the shape of the problem, and she wanted someone to know about it who might know what to do with it. I looked at the calculations for a long time, then I asked her to put them into a format that Commander Gerald Fitch's strategic team would be able to use, and I told her I would make sure they saw it. She said she would have it ready in 3 hours. She had it ready in 2. What Fitch's team did with that analysis is something that took ships slowly over the following weeks. I was not in the strategic planning sessions, but I saw the effects of them in the form of decisions that began to diverge from pure engagement planning. We began doing things that were designed to prolong the conflict in specific ways, not to extend our suffering, to extend theirs. We set up resupply and repair operations closer to the engagement zone than was tactically necessary, simply to ensure that we could sustain our position indefinitely without strain. We demonstrated at the outer boundary capabilities that we had held in reserve, not because we needed to use them, but because we wanted the Veil theory to see them and factor them into their own logistical calculations. We maintained a constant visible presence that required them to maintain a constant visible counterpresence, and that counterpresence sustained over months was not free. None of this was elegant. None of it was the kind of thing that makes a good story when told simply. It was patient and calculated, and it was informed by Lena Graves' model and by the understanding that we were not only fighting an engagement, we were changing the cost-benefit calculation of an empire that had never had to seriously reconsider a campaign before. The third engagement happened 7 weeks after the second. It was shorter than either of the previous 2. The Veil theory pressed hard early, withdrew when our new targeting solutions proved more effective than they had modeled, pressed again from a different angle, and then at the 90-minute mark did something that took everyone on our side a moment to process. They pulled back to the outer boundary without pressing to a conclusion. They had enough to continue fighting. Their fleet was not critically damaged. Their formation was intact. They pulled back because the engagement was not going the way their models said it should go, and the cost of continuing was, on Lena's model, compounding. Gerald Fitch looked at the sensor display and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "They are going to send someone to talk." The room looked at him. He said he had seen this pattern In records of historical conflicts, not alien ones, human ones, when a force with overwhelming resource advantage begins to make cost-conscious decisions. During an engagement, they are approaching the point where a negotiated result looks better than a continued campaign, not because they cannot win, because winning has become more expensive than they planned for, he said. We should expect a communication within 10 days. The communication came in 8. It was not from the fleet at the outer boundary. It came from a source that identified itself as the Veil Theory High Deliberative, which our linguists told us was approximately the highest governing authority in their structure. The message was long, and our translation team spent 2 days working through it before they were confident in its meaning. The meaning was this: the Veil Theory High Deliberative wished to open a channel of formal discourse. They were not offering terms, they were offering conversation. The distinction was made clearly, and our linguists believed it was genuine, not a procedural trick. I heard this and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, something more like vertigo. The situation was the same. The Veil Theory fleet was still at our outer boundary. We had not defeated them. They had not retreated, but they wanted to talk, and the fact that they wanted to talk meant something that was hard to fully absorb. They wanted to talk because we had made talking worth their time. I went to find Lena. She was, as she often was, at her workstation. I told her that her model had been right. She said she knew. She had updated it 3 times since submitting it to Fitch's team, and it kept saying the same thing. I asked her how she felt about it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I feel like we are standing at a door we have not opened yet, and I'm not sure what is on the other side. I said that was a reasonable way to feel. She said yes, but that we had opened every other door by just walking through it, and she did not see a reason to stop now. She went back to her screen. I went back to mine. Whatever came next was going to require everything we still had. The door was there. We were going to walk through it. The chamber where the formal discourse took place was not on Earth. It was on a neutral station that had been proposed by an observer species called the Renaki, who had apparently watched the entire conflict from a careful distance and had decided after the 3rd engagement that they wanted to be involved in whatever came next. I knew almost nothing about the Renaki at the time. I learned more in the weeks of preparation for the meeting. They were very old, not the oldest civilization represented in galactic society, which was itself a phrase I had not used comfortably before this period, but old enough to have their own records of the Valkyrie conducting campaigns of the type we had just survived. They had watched those campaigns. They had stayed out of them as they had stayed out of most things, being a species that appeared to prioritize observation over intervention, but something about our specific situation had moved them to act, even in the limited capacity of offering neutral ground. I was not in the diplomatic delegation. Caleb Horn, structural engineer, was not the right person for a formal discourse with an interstellar governing authority, but I was part of the technical advisory group that accompanied the delegation because the delegation needed people who could answer detailed questions about what we had built and how it worked and what it meant for any agreement that might be reached. The journey to the neutral station took 3 weeks. I spent those weeks as working on the technical documentation that the advisory group was preparing, and also talking with the people around me more than I had talked with anyone in a long time. Something about the transit, the strange suspended quality of being between one thing and whatever came next, made conversation feel more natural than it had during the intense months of development and conflict. I talked with a woman named Claire Fenn, who was one of the diplomatic advisors. She was from Edinburgh originally, though she had spent most of her career working in multilateral contexts that had nothing to do with alien contact until everything did. She was sharp and patient in a combination I had not often seen, and she had a habit of asking questions that she already knew the answer to, not to test you, but because she found that hearing the answer said aloud helped her think more clearly about the problem. She asked me one evening what I thought we were trying to achieve in the discourse. I said the obvious answer: an end to the conflict, the withdrawal of the Veil Ferry fleet, security for Earth and the colonies and the stations. She said, yes, and what else? I thought about it. I said, I think we're trying to establish that we are not what their category system says we are. She nodded slowly. She said, that was part of it. She said, the harder part was that we also had to establish what we actually were, and that was a harder proposition because we were still figuring it out ourselves. I said, that felt uncomfortably accurate. She said, most true things were uncomfortable. Some direction. The neutral station was unlike anything I had seen before. The Renaki had built it over a very long period, and it showed in the layering of different construction philosophies, different materials, different approaches to the basic problem of how to make a structure that worked for beings with different physical requirements. Walking through it was a lesson in alien architecture that I did not have the context to fully process. I simply moved through it carefully and tried to pay attention to everything, which is what I always did in new environments. The Veil Ferry delegation was already there when we arrived. I saw them at a distance during the first day of the preparatory period. They were taller than I had imagined, which I recognize as an odd thing to say about beings I had only ever experienced as voices and sensor signatures and weapons fire, taller and quieter in their movements than seemed natural for their size, and I watched them from across the wide open space of the station's central concourse and thought about the voice that had sent us the notification and said the word assisted extinction as though it were a weather forecast. I did not know what I felt looking at them. I tried to be honest with Alf about it and found that I could not fully resolve the various things happening in my chest into a single clean emotion. There was something like recognition, which surprised me. The recognition of being in the presence of something that had shaped the last years of my life in the most fundamental possible way, and beneath it something else, something older and more basic that I had felt first in that broken station, watching 14 empty suits float in the silence. I looked at them for a long time, then I went back to the technical documentation. The formal discourse began 3 days after our arrival. It was conducted in stages with the Renaki observers present throughout, and it moved in a way that was nothing like any human negotiation I had ever observed or read about. The Veil Ferry did not make offers and counter-offers. They stated positions long internally consistent, positions that their delegation presented with a completeness that made it clear they had prepared for a very long time. Their core position was this: humanity was an anomaly in their assessment framework. The conflict had produced outcomes outside the modeled parameters for a Category 1 species. They were willing to initiate a formal reassessment. During the reassessment period, hostilities would be suspended. At the end of the reassessment, humanity would be assigned a new categorical designation that would govern future interactions. Claire Finn, when she received the translation of this, was quiet for exactly 3 minutes. I know, because I was timing it. Not for any specific reason, just because the silence had a quality that made me want to measure it. Then she said, "They are offering to look at us again as though we are a specimen." I said, "Yes, that was what it sounded like." She said that was not acceptable, not because the suspension of hostilities was bad. The suspension of hostilities was good, obviously, but accepting a framework which we waited for them to reassess us and assign us a new category was accepting a framework in which they had authority over our status. She said she was not going to do that. I asked what the alternative was. She said, them the category system is wrong, not wrong about us specifically, wrong as a framework, because what it cannot account for is what we demonstrated. And we did not demonstrate something exceptional to humanity. We demonstrated something fundamental to what we are, which means any system that could not predict it is a system that is measuring the wrong things. She spent 2 days preparing the delegation's response. I was involved in one portion of it, the technical portion, where we presented not just what we had built, but the process by which we had built it, the speed, the collaboration, the number of individual contributors who had not been directed but who had simply oriented themselves toward the problem and begun working, the quality of the results relative to the resources available. We were not presenting it as evidence of superiority. We were presenting it as evidence of a different kind of thing, entirely a kind of thing that the category system as designed was not built to measure. The Veil Thari delegation received this response and did something that their own observers described through the Renaki translators as unprecedented in their diplomatic history. They asked questions, not challenging questions, not the kind designed to find weaknesses in an argument, genuine questions. How did you coordinate without a centralized directive structure? What was the decision-making process for the kinetic weapon implementation given its deviation from standard energy weapon paradigms? What was the average age of the individuals who developed the counter-frequency field? And what was their prior experience with weapons applications? The answers were honest. We coordinated because the people involved chose to coordinate. The decision to use kinetic weapons was made by several teams independently and then combined because the results were better. Combined, the average age of Lena Graves' team was 31. Their prior experience with weapons applications was predominantly none. The Veil Theory delegation was quiet for a long time. After this last answer, their lead delegate, whom we had given the working name the Arbiter because we did not know their actual name or title, turned to the other delegates and spoke at length in their own language, not through the translation system, as though the conversation was for them and not for us. I sat in the observation area and watched this and tried to read something from their body language, which was a project complicated by the fact that I had no framework for reading their body language, but I noticed that the arbiter's posture changed during the internal exchange. Something in the orientation of their upper body shifted, not toward us internally, toward the other delegates. It was the shift of a being encountering a problem that required rethinking rather than recalculating. They came back to the table. The arbiter spoke and the translation came through a moment later. They said, humanity's trajectory does not conform to available precedent. Category reassignment within the existing framework is insufficient. A new designation framework may be required. Claire Finn said, we are not interested in a new designation. We are interested in a relationship. Translator worked for a moment. The veil theory delegates spoke briefly among themselves. Then the arbiter said, elaborate. What followed was 4 days of the most intensive conversation I had ever witnessed. I was not central to most of it. Claire Fenn and 2 other members of the diplomatic delegation carried the weight of it. I contributed in the technical advisory sessions, where the Valtharu detailed questions about our development process continued, and occasionally in the evening briefings where the delegation reviewed the day's exchanges and prepared for the next. On the 3rd day of that intensive exchange, something happened that nobody had planned for. One of the Valtharu delegates, not the arbiter, a figure who had been quiet through most of the discourse, requested a separate channel outside the formal session. The request went through the Renaki, who approved it. What was said in that separate channel was shared with our delegation. Afterward, the delegate, speaking without the arbiter's oversight, said that there were members of the Valtharu deliberative who had been watching this conflict with growing concern, not about the tactical situation but about the precedent, not for humanity. The efficiency of the category system, they said, was also a limitation. It had created an organization built around a single approach to interstellar management, and an organization built around a single approach does not, in the long term, respond well to the world. Outside that approach, they were not asking for our help. They were, as far as we could tell, thinking aloud about something they had been thinking about for longer than this conflict had existed. Claire Fenn, when she heard this, said only, interesting. Then she incorporated it into her framing for the 4th day without making it explicit. And I watched her plant a very careful seed in the formal discourse that I only recognized in retrospect. On the 4th day, the Valtharu arbiter made an offer that was not a categorization. They offered a cessation agreement, a formal open-ended cessation of the resolution campaign with no categorical designation, governed by a set of terms that would require renegotiation at intervals agreed upon by both parties. The terms included a mutual boundary respect clause. They included a communication protocol for future disputes. They included, and this was the part that took our delegation 2 hours to confirm that they had translated correctly, an acknowledgement that the previous assessment of humanity had been conducted under incomplete informational parameters. Incomplete informational parameters in Valthari diplomatic language, our linguists told This was as close to we were wrong as their formal register could express. Clarfin accepted the offer. She accepted it without theatrics, without visible emotion, in the same plain and patient voice she used for everything. She said that the terms were acceptable to the human delegation and that she looked forward to the renegotiation process as a means of developing a more complete informational basis for both parties. The arbiter, through the translation, said something that took the linguists a moment to work through. Because it was not standard formal language, it was closer to informal register. It translated approximately as, "We have not had this conversation before. We find it unusual." Clarfin said, "We find most things unusual. It has not slowed us down." The signing of the cessation agreement was a formal ceremony conducted in the Renaki style, which involved a sequence of acknowledgments by each party that were recorded in multiple formats by the Renaki observers. I was not required to be present for the ceremony. I went anyway. I stood in the back of the chamber and watched the delegates at the table, human and Valthari, going through the steps of a process that neither of their species had done before, and I thought about the years that had led here and all the people in them. I thought about Diane, who I had finally managed to speak with for an extended period the week before the journey to the neutral station. She had been in Cape Town. She had kept the plan on my windowsill alive, which turned out to be a longer project than either of us had expected. She had sent me photographs. The plant had grown significantly. I thought about Arthur Cole, who was aboard a ship at the outer boundary, monitoring the situation and working on what he already called the third generation of the shell program, because, as he had told me, the cessation agreement was not the same as a permanent peace, and he intended to have better numbers when the renegotiation came. I thought about Samuel Park, who was 23 years old and had walked out of a university program in the middle of his degree to come work on the problem, and who had, through the course of it, done work that would have earned him a doctorate several times over in any field he touched, and who I hoped would go back to school afterward because he deserved the credential, even though he clearly did not need it. I thought about Grace Elliott, asleep at her desk with a jacket over her shoulders. I thought about Owen Price and his maps, and I thought about Lena Graves, who had asked me in the common area of a station wagon whether we were turning ourselves into something she was not sure she recognized. I did not have a complete answer for her then. I was not sure I had one now. We had changed. The months of work and the engagements and the long, strange road to this chamber had changed us in ways that I was still measuring. Some of what we had become was genuinely better than what we had been. Some of it was harder. Some of it was things I did not yet have words for, but we were still here, and we were still us in the way that matters. The Owen Price way, the Grace Elliott way, the Samuel Park way, the way that cannot be categorized by a system built to measure what you have done rather than what you might do. After the ceremony, I found Lena Graves standing at a port window looking out at the stars. I stood beside her. While without speaking, she said, "Do you think they understand us now?" I said I thought they understood us better. I was not sure better was the same as completely. She said, "Good. It would be boring if they understood us completely." We stood at the window for a long time. Outside there were the same stars. They had always been indifferent to human categories and veil theory models and all. The accumulated weight of what had happened between them, they were just stars, ancient and enormous and entirely uninterested in what we made of ourselves beneath them, which was, I thought, exactly right. The universe does not care what you are, it only cares what you do. We had done something we were still figuring out. What exactly, but the figuring out was the part that had always been ours, and we had proven in the most comprehensive way available to us that nobody was going to take it from us. The cessation held the fleet at the outer boundary, withdrew over the following 3 weeks. I watched it happen on a sensor display from the coordination hub, the same display I had watched the first engagement on, and I noticed that Cora Webb was beside me again. She said, "They are actually leaving," I said. "Yes," she said, "I thought I would feel different when this happened," I said. "I thought I would too," she said. "What do you actually feel?" I thought about it honestly. I said I felt like someone who had run a very long distance and stopped and was now standing still. And the standing still felt strange because the running had lasted so long. That stillness required adjustment. She nodded. She said she thought that was about right. The last veil theory ship crossed the outer boundary at 17 minutes past midnight station time. The sensor display showed empty space where the fleet had been, not completely empty. The stars were still there, but no ships, no formation, no vast assembly of vessels that had been sent to conduct process and had instead encountered something their process could not account for. I looked at the empty space for a long time. Then I thought about Arthur Cole and his third generation shell program and Samuel Parks targeting upgrades and Lena Graves, who was probably already at a whiteboard working on something none of us had thought of yet. The renegotiation would come. The universe was large and complex, and what we had learned in these years was that the right answer to complexity was not to simplify it. It was to keep working, keep building, keep paying attention to what was actually there rather than what you expected to find. We had made the universe take notice of us, not by being the largest or the oldest or the most powerful, by being something that could not be correctly predicted by any model built on the assumption that they already knew what we were. We were still building the model for ourselves. I thought that was probably how it should be. I turned away from the sensor display. There was work to do. There was always gratefully endlessly work to do. I found Arthur Cole's latest data report waiting in my message queue. I opened it and started reading. Outside the station, the stars held their long silence, which was not the silence of an empty universe, but the silence of one that was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely curious about what we would do next. So were we.